I'll never forget the sound of that slap. It wasn't just the sting against my cheek. It was the sound of everything breaking at once. The picture frames on the wall trembled slightly, maybe from my own shaking hands or maybe from the weight of what he'd just done. My father had never raised a hand to me before that day, but there he stood, jaw tight, eyes burning, and his voice shaking with something between fury and shame. "You're a disgrace, Emily," he said. "You've ruined this family." Those words, "You've ruined this family," echoed in my head for weeks afterward, like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. At first I thought I'd done something unforgivable. Maybe I had. Maybe I deserved his anger. But what none of us knew then, not even me, was that the truth, when it finally came out, would make every one of his words fall apart. Because when the lawyers walked into that living room 2 months later, the truth they carried didn't just change his opinion of me. It changed everything we thought we knew about our family. My name is Emily Carter. I was 33 that year, living in a quiet town in western Pennsylvania, the kind of place where people still wave when they drive past you, and where everyone knows who your parents are. My father, Richard Carter, was one of those men people respected without really knowing why. He ran the local hardware store, sponsored the town's baseball team, and always sat in the same pew at church. My mother, Margaret, passed away when I was 17. Cancer. After that, it was just me and Dad. Growing up, I thought we were close. He'd taught me how to fix a leaky faucet, how to check my own oil, how to stand straight when people tried to push me down. But his love came with rules, unspoken ones. Things like, don't cry too much, don't question me, and don't ever embarrass this family. So I learned to be the kind of daughter who didn't make trouble. I went to college nearby, got my degree in accounting, and even came back home afterward to help with the store's finances. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe, familiar. That was until I met David. He'd walked into the store one rainy Thursday in March, looking for some electrical parts for a house he was renovating. He was tall, had kind eyes, and smiled like he wasn't in a rush. We talked for a while about the weather, the renovations, the awful coffee at the gas station across the street. It wasn't love at first sight, but it was something close to peace at first sight. Dad didn't like him from the beginning. He said David was too quiet, which was funny coming from a man who rarely spoke about anything other than work and church. Still, David and I kept seeing each other. Dinners, long walks, late-night drives with the windows down, and Springsteen on the radio. For the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't living by anyone else's checklist. But then, the problems started small, little things. Dad stopped asking me about my day. He'd look up when I walked into a room but not really see me. One night when I told him David had asked me to move in with him, he slammed his fork down so hard that gravy splattered across the table. "Do what you want," he said coldly. "You already have." I didn't move in right away. I wanted his blessing. But the distance between us grew, quiet and sharp. Then, a few months later, it happened. The slap. That morning had started like any other. I was at the store sorting through invoices when I noticed something strange. A withdrawal from the business account, $50,000. I thought it was a mistake at first. Maybe Dad had made a big purchase order and forgotten to tell me. But the more I looked, the more I realized it wasn't that simple. The money had been transferred to a private account, his account, one I'd never seen before. When I asked him about it that evening, his reaction stunned me. "Why are you looking at my accounts?" he snapped, his voice rising. "Dad, I manage the books," I said. Quietly. "That's literally my job." He went red, not embarrassed, but furious. "Don't you dare question me about money. You think just because you have a degree you know better than me?" I tried to explain that I wasn't accusing him of anything, but he wouldn't let me speak. Then came the moment. The one burned into my memory. He stood up, pointed his finger at me, and shouted, "You've been snooping around behind my back, haven't you? What are you planning, Emily? To steal from me? To take what's mine for that no-good boyfriend of yours?" That's when his hand came down, a sharp, echoing crack. And then silence. I remember the way his breathing sounded, shallow, almost scared. And then he whispered it, "You're a disgrace. I left that night with nothing but my purse and the clothes on my back. I stayed with David for a while, trying to convince myself I hadn't done anything wrong, but deep down, I was shaken, not just by the slap, but by the realization that my father had become someone I didn't recognize. For weeks, he refused to take my calls. People in town started whispering about the argument, about me stealing from the store, about how I'd broken my poor father's heart. And then, one afternoon, a black SUV pulled into David's driveway. Two men in suits stepped out. They introduced themselves as lawyers. And that's when everything began to unravel. When I first saw those lawyers standing on the porch, I thought maybe Dad had sent them to press charges. That's how bad things had gotten. My mind immediately went to war. They were both neatly dressed, middle-aged, with those polite but unreadable smiles that lawyers seem to practice in front of mirrors. One of them, Mr. Keller, spoke first. "Miss Carter, we're here regarding your mother's estate." My heart stumbled. "My mother's estate?" I repeated. "She passed away 16 years ago." He nodded calmly. "Yes, ma'am. There have been some developments." David hovered behind me, uncertain whether to step in. I invited them inside, made coffee out of habit, though my hands were shaking so hard I spilled some on the counter. The smell of roasted beans filled the kitchen, warm but tense. They sat down at the table, opened a folder, and placed several documents in front of me. Mr. Keller leaned forward, his voice careful. "Your mother, Margaret Carter, established a trust shortly before her passing. According to the records, it was to be divided equally between her husband and her only daughter upon her death." I frowned. "I've never heard of any trust." "That's what we thought might be the case," he said, exchanging a glance with his colleague. "It seems the terms were never disclosed to you. In fact, they were altered after your mother passed." "Altered? By who?" He hesitated. "By your father." For a moment the room felt smaller, like the walls had moved an inch closer. David reached for my hand under the table. Mr. Keller continued, "Your father filed an amendment that removed your name from the trust entirely, citing that you had relinquished claim through a signed waiver." I stared at him. "I never signed anything." He nodded slowly. "That's why we're here." For the next hour they explained everything. How an internal audit at their law firm had uncovered irregularities in several old estate cases. How one of the clerks had noticed my mother's file seemed incomplete. How a handwriting analyst had questioned the authenticity of one signature, mine. It was dated 2 weeks after my mother's death. I was 17 at the time, grieving, confused, barely holding myself together. David asked, "So you're saying someone forged her signature?" Mr. Keller nodded. "It appears that way, yes." My throat tightened. Why would my father do that? He didn't answer directly. "We're not here to accuse anyone, Miss Carter. We simply need to confirm whether you were aware of the trust and whether you ever signed such a document." I felt a strange mix of numbness and fury rising inside me. All those years, all those times my father told me to be grateful for what we had, to not ask too many questions about money, suddenly made sense. He'd told me we couldn't afford college out of state. He'd told me we had to take out a loan to keep the store afloat. He'd told me I was lucky he'd given me a job at all. And now I was sitting here realizing that maybe the money my mother left for me, her final gift, had been stolen before I even became an adult. After the lawyers left, I sat at the kitchen table long after the coffee had gone cold. The papers they'd shown me were still spread out, their neat lines of text like quiet accusations. David finally broke the silence. What are you going to do?" I shook my head. "I don't know. I mean, what if it's true? What if he forged it? What kind of man does that to his own daughter?" He looked at me carefully. "Maybe it's time to find out." I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying every memory I had of my father, his steady hands fixing a loose cabinet hinge, his voice reading me Bible verses at night, the way he'd call me his little girl even after I was grown. And yet, there was always something in his love, a tightness, a control. I used to think it came from fear of losing me after Mom died, but now I wondered if it came from guilt. The next morning I drove to the store. My heart pounded the entire way, not from fear of confrontation, but from the ache of knowing that I had to face the possibility that my own father had betrayed me, long before the slap. He was behind the counter when I walked in, wearing his usual flannel shirt and old leather apron. When he looked up and saw me, his expression hardened immediately. "What do you want?" he said flatly. "Dad," I started, keeping my voice even, "some lawyers came to see me yesterday." He froze for half a second, so small a pause I might have missed it if I wasn't watching him closely. Then he busied himself with a pile of receipts. "Lawyers? What about?" "Mom's estate," that made him stop. The pencil in his hand snapped clean in two. "Estate? That's all been settled for years." "Apparently not," I said quietly. "They said there's a trust, one that was supposed to include me." He looked up then, eyes sharp but his face strangely pale. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I saw the papers, Dad. The signature on the waiver, it's not mine." Something dark flickered across his face. He didn't deny it. He didn't even try to explain. Instead, he slammed the drawer shut so hard the cash register rattled. "You listen to me," he said, voice trembling. "You stay away from those people. They're stirring up old trouble that doesn't concern you." "Doesn't concern me?" I asked, my voice breaking. "It's my mother's money, Dad. It's my name on those documents." He stepped forward, close enough for me to see the gray in his beard, the anger pulsing just under his skin. "You think you know everything, don't you? Always poking around, always trying to find something to blame me for. You don't understand what it takes to protect a family." "Protect?" I whispered. "Is that what you call it?" He turned away then, muttering something I couldn't quite catch. Something about what she never needed to know. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about money. There was something deeper he was hiding, something that terrified him enough to risk everything. That night, I sat on the porch with David, the air heavy and still. He handed me a cup of tea, and I held it just to feel the warmth against my shaking fingers. "What if he did it to protect someone else?" I asked softly. "Who?" "I don't know," I said. "But he said something today. Something about what I never needed to know." David hesitated. "Do you think your mom might have left a letter or something? A clue?" The thought hit me like a spark. I hadn't looked through Mom's old things in years. After she passed, Dad boxed everything up and stored it in the attic. Said it was too painful to keep them around. But now, I wasn't so sure pain was the reason. The next morning, I drove back to the house I'd grown up in. The key still fit, though the door stuck a little when I pushed it open. The smell of old pine cleaner and dust filled the air, familiar, distant. I climbed up to the attic, flashlight in hand. The space was cramped, full of cardboard boxes labeled in Dad's neat handwriting: Christmas, tax records, Margaret. I opened the one with Mom's name. Inside were photo albums, her favorite scarf, a dried corsage from her last anniversary dinner, and at the very bottom, a sealed envelope with my name written in her handwriting. My heart nearly stopped. It was dated 3 days before she died. I sat there in that dim attic, the dust motes swirling like tiny ghosts in the sunlight. The envelope in my hands felt too light for how heavy it made my heart feel. My mother's handwriting, looping, gentle, unmistakable, spelled my name in blue ink, Emily. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My fingers trembled so much I had to steady them against my knees before I could slide a letter opener under the seal. The paper inside had yellowed slightly around the edges, but the ink was still clear. "My sweet girl, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't hold on much longer. I need you to know that everything I've ever done was to make sure you'd be safe, even after I'm gone. You may not understand this now, but there are things your father and I didn't agree on. Things about the store, about the money your grandparents left, and about how it should be used. I tried to make sure your future would be secure. If for any reason that changes, trust your heart, not your fear. You are stronger than you think, Emily. Don't let anyone, not even your father, tell you otherwise. Love always, Mom." My throat tightened as I read those words. They felt like a whisper from another world, like she'd been watching all this time, waiting for me to find the courage to look. There was no mention of a trust, no explicit warning, but I didn't need one. The message was clear: she'd left something behind for me, and my father had made sure I'd never see it. I stayed up there for nearly an hour, just sitting in the stillness, listening to the quiet creaks of the house that had raised me. I kept wondering how many nights my mother must have lain awake, knowing what was coming. Not just her death, but the fight that would follow. When I finally climbed down, the world felt different, colder, sharper. That night I called Mr. Keller. I found something, I told him. He asked me to bring the letter to his office the next morning. When I handed it to him, he read it slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This doesn't directly reference the trust," he said, "but it does confirm that she was concerned about how her estate would be handled. That strengthens your case, Miss Carter." "My case?" I asked. "I haven't filed one." He smiled gently. "Maybe not yet, but if the signature on that waiver was forged, it's fraud. You're entitled to the portion your mother intended for you." The words entitled and portion felt wrong in my mouth. I didn't want money. I wanted truth. But truth, it seemed, came with paperwork. When word reached my father that I'd gone to the lawyers again, he showed up at David's house the next morning. I opened the door, and he didn't even say hello, just barged in, his boots thudding against the hardwood. "You had no right to go digging through her things," he said, his voice low but dangerous. "She was my mother," I replied. "I had every right." He slammed his fist on the counter. "You're going to ruin everything." "What exactly is everything, Dad?" I asked, because from where I'm standing, all I see is a lie. His jaw tightened, his eyes darting to David, who stood quietly behind me. "This isn't your fight, son," he warned. David didn't flinch. "It is. If you keep hurting her." That was the first time I'd ever seen my father look small, not because of his height or his age, but because he realized he'd lost control. I spoke softly, almost pleading. "Just tell me the truth. Why did you forge my name?" He froze. His lips parted, then closed again. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "I did it to protect you." I stared at him, disbelief flooding through me. "Protect me? From what?" He rubbed his temples, pacing. "Your mother. She wanted to split everything 50-50. But she didn't know how much debt we were in after your grandfather's business went under. The store would have gone bankrupt if I hadn't taken control. I thought if I could keep things together, you'd have a future here. You wouldn't need to worry. You took my future," I said quietly. "You decided I wasn't capable of having a choice in it." He shook his head. "You were a child, Emily. You didn't understand. And now I'm an adult, and you still think I don't deserve to know the truth." He turned toward the door, his hand trembling on the knob. "You'll see one day. Sometimes you have to do the wrong thing for the right reason." Then he left. For days after that, I wandered through a haze of confusion and anger. His words replayed over and over, the wrong thing for the right reason. It might have made sense if he'd confessed, apologized, anything. But instead he'd doubled down. He'd rather let me believe I was the villain than face what he'd done. Mr. Keller filed a preliminary claim to reopen the trust. He said the court would likely issue a notice to my father soon. I dreaded that moment, not for the legal battle, but for the humiliation it would bring him. Still, a small part of me believed that once the truth was out, he'd finally stop treating me like an enemy. But I underestimated how far pride can go when it's wounded. 2 weeks later, I walked into the grocery store and felt the stares before I even reached the produce section. Whispering, side glances. Small-town gossip spreading faster than wildfire. One woman I'd known since childhood approached me by the tomatoes. "Emily," she said softly, "I heard you're suing your own father." I felt my cheeks burn. "That's not—" She cut me off with a sympathetic smile. "Families fight. I just hope you can forgive each other." By the time I got home, I was shaking. I hadn't told anyone about the case, which meant Dad had. When I called him that night, he didn't pick up. But he sent a message instead. Short, sharp, final, "You've made your choice. Don't come near me again." I didn't cry. Not then. I think I'd already run out of tears weeks before. But the next morning, when Mr. Keller called and said, "Emily, you might want to sit down," my knees gave out. He told me that my father had just transferred ownership of the hardware store. Not to me, not even to the bank, but to someone else entirely. Someone named Janet Price. The name didn't ring a bell at first. And then it did. Janet Price was my father's old friend, the widow who brought him casseroles after church and always called me dear with that pitying look in her eyes. I hung up the phone and stared at the wall, the pieces of the puzzle locking together with sickening clarity. The money, the lies, the secrecy, the protection. He hadn't forged my name to save me, he'd done it to save her. And that was when something inside me, something fragile but steady, finally snapped into focus. I wasn't going to cry anymore. I was going to fight. That night, I didn't sleep. The air in David's house felt too still, too heavy with the weight of betrayal. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face. Not the face of the man who'd taught me to ride a bike or patch a hole in drywall, but the one who'd looked me in the eye and said, "You're a disgrace." The next morning, I made coffee the way Mom used to. Percolator on the stove, slow drip, quiet hiss. I needed to think, to feel the small rhythms of control returning to my hands. David came into the kitchen, his hair tousled from sleep. "You didn't come to bed," he said softly. "I couldn't," I admitted. "I think I finally understand why he's been hiding everything. It wasn't about me, it was about Janet." He leaned against the counter. "The woman from church?" I nodded. "She's the one he transferred the store to." David exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "So, what now?" I stared at the coffee swirling in my mug. Now I stopped being the scared daughter who lets him control the story. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, meetings, and tense phone calls. Mr. Keller helped me file a formal injunction to freeze the store's transfer. It wasn't easy. Dad had already notarized everything. But the lawyers argued that if the trust itself had been tampered with years ago, then all subsequent ownership could be questioned. The case became local news. Carter family legal dispute rocks small town. I hated seeing our names in the paper. The whispers that had once lived in grocery aisles now filled every corner of the community. Dad stopped coming to church. People said he was embarrassed. I think deep down he was angry, not just at me, but at the world for seeing him as flawed. And still, I couldn't bring myself to hate him. I just wanted him to tell the truth. A week before the first court hearing, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, folded twice. "Emily, you think you understand, but you don't. I did what I had to do. I made mistakes, but not the ones you think. Come to the store tonight, after closing, alone, Dad." David wanted to come with me, but something told me I had to go by myself. It wasn't fear. It was the sense that this confrontation needed to happen without witnesses. When I arrived, the store was dark except for the dim light in the back office. The same creaky floorboards, the same smell of sawdust and motor oil. My whole childhood was written into those walls. He was sitting behind the desk, his shoulders slumped, a man worn thin by his own choices. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. "I almost didn't." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." I stayed standing. He sighed. "You always were stubborn like your mother." For a moment we just looked at each other, two people bound by blood and silence. Finally I asked, "Why Janet? Why give everything to her?" He rubbed his face, his hand trembling. "Because I owed her." "Owed her? She loaned me money. Years ago when your mother was sick. The insurance didn't cover half of what we needed for treatment. I didn't want to tell you. You were 17, scared enough already. Janet helped, quietly. I promised I'd pay her back, and instead you gave her the store?" He nodded. "It was the only way. I thought, if I made sure she was taken care of, she wouldn't say anything about how bad things really got. I tried to process it. So you lied. For years. You let me believe Mom didn't care about me enough to leave me anything." His eyes filled with something. Shame, maybe. "I thought I was protecting you from the burden." "No," I said quietly. "You were protecting your pride." He looked down at his hands. They were the same hands that had built that store from the ground up. Strong once, now trembling. "I know you think I'm a monster," he said. "But when your mother died, I didn't know how to live without her. I made choices I shouldn't have. Every time I saw you look at me, I saw her, and I couldn't stand to see the disappointment. My chest ached. So you hit me instead? He flinched. I shouldn't have. God help me, Emily, that was the worst moment of my life. For a long moment there was only silence between us. The hum of the old refrigerator in the next room was the only sound. Then I said, "You can still make this right, Dad. Come to court, tell them what you did. Tell them the truth." He shook his head. "I can't." "Why not?" "Because if I do, they'll charge me with fraud. I could lose everything." "You already did," I said. He looked up, and for the first time in my life I saw tears in his eyes. Not angry ones, tired ones. "Go home, Emily," he whispered. "Please. Let me take the fall in my own way." I wanted to reach out to him, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the years of control, of silence, of him deciding what I needed to know. I just couldn't be the one to comfort him anymore. When I walked out of that store, the air was thick with the smell of oil and sawdust, the scent of my childhood, the scent of endings. 2 days later, he didn't show up to court. Mr. Keller looked worried, but the judge proceeded with the hearing in his absence. We presented the documents, the letter from my mother, the forged signature, the financial transfers. When the evidence was read aloud, I felt the weight of every year I'd spent doubting myself lift, little by little, and then the courtroom door opened. My father walked in, late, pale, but there. He raised his hand and said, "Your Honor, I have a statement." The room went still. He admitted to everything, the forgery, the altered trust, the transfer to Janet. His voice was quiet, cracking. "I did it," he said, "but not out of greed. I did it because I was afraid to lose what I built, afraid to face my own mistakes, and most of all, afraid that my daughter would see me for what I really am." When he said that, I cried. Not out of anger this time, but because I finally saw the man behind. The anger. Broken, regretful, human. The judge didn't pass sentence that day. He ordered a review. But in that courtroom, surrounded by people who'd whispered and judged, I saw something I hadn't seen in months. A flicker of peace on my father's face, as if telling the truth had finally let him breathe. That night, he called me for the first time since it all began. "I'm sorry," he said simply. And for the first time, I believed him. The weeks that followed the court hearing felt like walking through fog. Heavy, gray, uncertain. The entire town knew by then. Small towns are like that, secrets spread faster than storms. At first I avoided going out altogether. Every time I stepped into the grocery store or the post office, I felt eyes on me. Some sympathetic, some curious, some quietly judgmental. People love a scandal when it's not their own. The hardest part was hearing my father's name whispered in past tense. "Did you hear about Richard Carter? Used to run the hardware store. Terrible shame what happened to that family." They said it like he was gone, even though he still lived just 3 streets away, in the same brick house where I'd grown up. But I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired. Tired of defending myself. Tired of feeling guilty for telling the truth. Tired of carrying the weight of a story I hadn't written. One chilly morning in early November, I drove to the courthouse for the final settlement hearing. The air smelled like frost and wood smoke, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. Dad was already there, sitting quietly beside his lawyer. He looked smaller somehow, like a man who'd finally stopped pretending to be invincible. Janet wasn't there. I later learned she'd returned the store deed voluntarily after the court contacted her. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The proceedings were short. The court found that my father had indeed forged the signature and altered the trust illegally. But instead of jail time, the judge ruled for restitution and mandatory financial counseling. Leniency, he said, in light of my father's age and his full confession. When it was over, the gavel hit the bench with a soft thud, and I felt an invisible door close on a chapter I never asked to open. Outside, Dad waited by the courthouse steps. The sky was overcast, the wind cutting through the trees. He looked at me, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. "You got what you wanted," he said quietly. I shook my head. "No, Dad, I got what Mom wanted. The truth." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground. I thought if I could keep everything under control, I could protect what we had, but all I did was destroy it. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, just the sound of wind and passing cars. Then, almost hesitantly, he reached into his coat pocket and handed me a small, folded piece of paper. "I found this after the hearing," he said. "It was in one of your mother's old recipe boxes. I think she meant for you to have it." I unfolded it. The handwriting was faint, familiar. "If you're reading this, then maybe we didn't get to say goodbye properly. Remember, Em, love doesn't always show up the way we expect. Sometimes it hides behind fear. But fear isn't love's opposite. It's just love's shadow." I read it twice, then looked up at him. His eyes glistened. "I didn't deserve her," he whispered. "No," I said softly, "but she loved you anyway." He nodded, the tears finally spilling down his cheeks. "I'm sorry for what I did to you. For the slap, for the lies, for everything." And then, in a small, trembling voice, he added, "You really are your mother's daughter." I wanted to say something, to forgive him right there. But forgiveness isn't a single act, it's a process. A slow untangling of pain. So instead, I just nodded and said, "Take care of yourself, Dad." He smiled faintly. "You too, sweetheart." Over the next few months, life began to quietly settle again. I took over what was left of the store. Not for the money. It was barely profitable anymore. But because it felt right to keep it alive. I hired a few young locals, repainted the front windows, and added a small sign near the door that read, "Carter and Company." People started to trickle back. Some out of curiosity, others out of loyalty to the Carter name. A few apologized for believing the rumors. I didn't hold it against them. People only see the pieces of a story they're given. Dad stopped by one afternoon in spring, a few months after the ruling. He didn't stay long. Just stood near the counter, watching as I balanced the register, the same one he'd slammed shut in anger months before. "I heard business is picking up," he said with a small smile. Slowly, I replied. He nodded, looking around the place with a mix of pride and sorrow. "Your mother would have been proud of you." Something in me softened then. Maybe because for once, his words didn't feel like an order or an expectation. They felt like truth. Before he left, he placed a small box on the counter. Inside was his old watch, worn leather strap, scratched face, still ticking. "I want you to have it," he said. "It's time I stopped holding on to things I can't fix." That was the last time I saw him inside the store. A few months later, he sold his house and moved to a smaller town near the coast. I got a postcard from him that summer. A picture of a pier, a handwritten note on the back. "The air here smells like salt and freedom. I'm learning to forgive myself. I hope you can too." I didn't write back right away, but I kept the postcard on my fridge, next to one of Mom's old recipes. Peach cobbler, her favorite. By fall, people had stopped whispering when I walked by. I started volunteering at the local community center, teaching bookkeeping to single mothers trying to start their own businesses. It felt like the right way to honor what my mother wanted, that I build something of my own, something honest, and every time I locked up the store at night, I'd look at that old wooden counter, the one my father built by hand, and think, some legacies aren't about what we inherit, they're about what we rebuild from the wreckage. The first winter after everything ended was the quietest of my life. The kind of quiet that doesn't echo, doesn't ache, it just settles. I remember one night in January, snow falling thick and slow outside the shop windows. The bell above the door had gone silent hours ago, and the only light came from the soft amber glow of the old hanging lamp that used to sit above Dad's desk. I was closing up, balancing receipts, when I realized something. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was walking on someone else's path. I had spent so long trying to be the kind of daughter my father could be proud of that I forgot how to be proud of myself. Now, in that quiet, I finally felt a sense of peace. Not triumph, not revenge, just peace. A few months later, I took a trip to the coast to visit Dad. He'd been calling occasionally. Short, polite conversations about the weather, the store, his health. It was clear he wanted to mend things, but didn't know how to ask. When I arrived, he was waiting outside his small cottage by the water. His hair was whiter than I remembered, his shoulders thinner, but when he smiled, it was softer, freer. "Emily," he said, his voice trembling just a little, "you came." "Of course I did," I said, hugging him. His embrace was hesitant at first, then it deepened. Not the stiff kind of hug we'd always had, but a real one. He invited me inside. The place smelled of coffee and sea air. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a framed picture of Mom, the same one that used to hang in the living room back home. "I still talk to her sometimes," he admitted, his gaze distant. "Tell her what an idiot I've been." I smiled faintly. "She'd forgive you, you know." He looked at me then, eyes glassy. "Do you?" I took a slow breath. The truth was, forgiveness wasn't something I could offer like a gift. It had to grow, slowly, like ivy, winding through old wounds until it softened them. "I'm getting there," I said. "Some days I think I do. Other days I'm still angry. But I don't hate you, Dad. I never did." He nodded, tears forming. "That's more than I deserve." We sat by the fire that evening, sipping tea, talking about Mom, the way she'd hum while cooking, the way she always smelled like lavender and soap. For the first time, our conversations weren't weighed down by what had been lost. They were lifted by the memories of what had been good. When I left the next morning, he walked me to the car. The tide was rolling in, slow and rhythmic. He reached into his pocket and handed me a small seashell. "Found this the day I moved here," he said. "Thought maybe you could put it by her picture at the store." I turned it over in my hand, white, worn smooth by time and water. "Thank you," I whispered. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw him standing there, one hand raised, the wind tugging at his jacket. And for the first time, I didn't see the man who'd hit me, or the man who'd lied to me. I saw my father, flawed, broken, trying. When I got back home, the world felt different. The store, the house, the town, all the same, but somehow lighter. I placed the seashell beside Mom's picture and whispered, "He's trying, Mom. I think we both are." Over time, I started teaching a small bookkeeping class in the evenings. It wasn't fancy, just a few local women looking for a way to manage their finances better. But one night, as I listened to them laugh over coffee and notebooks, I realized how much I inherited from my mother. Not just her handwriting or her smile, but her quiet strength. She'd left me something more valuable than money. She'd left me the courage to tell the truth, even when it broke things open. Sometimes I still think about that slap, that sharp, painful moment when everything fell apart. But now, when I remember it, I don't feel the sting anymore. It's just a memory, a mark in the story that led me here. Because the truth is, healing doesn't come from making someone pay. It comes from learning how to live again after the pain. It comes from rebuilding trust, not just with others, but with yourself. And in that, I finally understood something my mother had written all those years ago. Fear isn't love's opposite, it's just love's shadow. Dad and I still talk every Sunday evening, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for an hour. The conversations aren't about the past anymore. They're about the weather, about his tomato plants, about the small things that make up a quiet life. And sometimes, that's enough. The last time we spoke, he said, "I was wrong about you, Emily. You were never a disgrace. You were just braver than I ever was. I didn't know what to say." So I just smiled and said, "I learned from the best parts of you, Dad." He chuckled. "Then I guess something good came out of all my mistakes." "Yes," I said softly, "it did. Sometimes I still drive past the old brick house where I grew up. The paint has faded, the shutters are cracked, and someone else's curtains hang in the window now. But when I stop at the light out front, I can still picture us inside. My mother humming softly, my father tinkering with the old radio, and me sitting at the kitchen table, thinking life would always stay that simple. It didn't, of course. Life has a way of peeling back the layers we build around our memories. Sometimes what we find underneath isn't pretty, but it's real. For a long time, I believed my father's anger was proof that I had failed him, that I was, as he said, a disgrace. But now I know that what he really feared wasn't my failure, it was my independence. He didn't know how to love me without controlling me, and I didn't know how to love him without forgiving him. In the end, we both had to learn. The truth the lawyers brought to my door that day didn't just change my life. It set something free in both of us. It forced me to face the pain, and it forced him to face himself. And that's the strange thing about truth. It hurts first. But then it heals. Now, when I think of my father, I don't think about the slap or the lies or the courtroom. I think about the man sitting by the sea, finally at peace with the parts of himself he'd spent a lifetime hiding. I think about forgiveness, how it isn't something we give for someone else, but something we give to ourselves, so we can stop carrying the weight of yesterday. And I think about my mother's words, "Love's shadow is fear." She was right. Love doesn't erase our mistakes, it simply shines light on them, until the shadow fades. So, if you've ever been hurt by someone you love, I'll ask you this. Would you have fought for the truth the way I did? Or would you have chosen silence and called it peace? Tell me in the comments. And if my story touched your heart tonight, stay a while, subscribe, and keep listening. Because sometimes the hardest stories are the ones that remind us we're not alone.